I have the honor today of moderating this talk, and I am thrilled to be introducing Dr. Charles Smith, who's going to be talking today a lot about what is extremely important and relevant to unions and citizens in this province. So this couldn't have come at a better time. The title today is called Workers, Unions, and the Fight for Democracy, Why Workers' Freedom of Association is Essential for Democracy, and I couldn't agree more with that title. So to describe what the talk today will be is talking about how historians of democracy often point to the extension of the franchise as a key moment when societies become, quote unquote, democratic. And yet, if the franchise is an essential barometer for health of democracy, such a narrow understanding tells us little about the health of a democracy in capitalist societies like our own. When you're looking at something like authoritarian power in the workplace, our understanding of democracy has to include the freedom of workers to freely associate against employers' unilateral authority to dictate things like the right to bargain and the right to strike. I'm sure there's a few folks here who would clap at that assessment. This needs to be understood more than simply as, withdrawing these rights as an attack on economic urgency. Rather, it's an attack on democracy itself. Dr. Smith here, I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about him, and then he's just going to jump right in and explore this further. Dr. Smith is a professor in the Department of the Political Studies at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan, and his research explores the intersections of Canadian political economy, public law and labor, and with a specific focus on collective bargaining rights and provincial politics. He's also the author of acclaimed books such as Transforming Provincial Politics and Unions in Court, and is the co-editor of a journal that I often read, Labor, or Le Travail. And he has a new book coming out, The New Politics of Western Canada, and I think this will also be really relevant, so I would encourage you all to pick that up as well. So without further ado, I just want to welcome Dr. Smith, and everybody give him a big welcome.
Well, thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be at this prestigious conference here on Treaty 6 territory. We shared that territory in Saskatoon, and it's an honor to be here talking to you today. I was thinking about this on the way in last night as I was flying in. I wanted to just make it clear that, yes, I am a Smith, but I am not related to that other Smith. There's no connection. I used to tell my students that I was related to Adam Smith, but that got old and they didn't believe me. So I did my PhD at York University in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and I worked under a guy, a professor named Leo Panich, who was really my guide through the work I do now. He's since passed away, but his work continues to influence the work I'm doing. In particular, in 1984, he published an article in the pages of Labor Le Travail, which is the journal that I co-edit today, with a guy named Donald Swartz, who looked at the increasing role of Canadian governments in restricting the ability of workers to go on strike and to withdraw their labor and to collectively bargain. That article was called The Assault on Trade Union Freedoms. Some of you might be familiar with that, it's since been published as a book. But in that article, they talked about, and they were curious about the notion that governments in Canada increasingly were using a legislative hammer to take away the ability of workers to challenge their employers on the picket line, at the bargaining table, and really to influence the sort of regression that employers were seeking in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, at the moment when, political economists would say we were transitioning from a Keynesian welfare capitalist society to a neoliberal dog-eat-dog, Reagan-esque, Thatcher-esque, right, political economy, Mulrooney-esque. For local content. Nobody else in the world says that, but in Canada we have to do that. And they were writing after the president of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, Jean-Claude Perrault, had been jailed for refusing to end a legal strike by the Trudeau the First government after it imposed bargaining settlements in 1982 6 and 5 program. They were writing after the first woman president of a major union in North America, Grace Hartman, who was president of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and two other CUPE officials were handed jail terms for their role in an Ontario hospital workers' strike in 1981. So they were jailed for defying a back-to-work order. So the heavy hand of the state was pretty clear that bargaining was fine until it became inconvenient or a problem for us, the state. So in reviewing this crisis of accumulation in North American capitalism in this period, Panich and Swartz highlighted the inconsistencies in the capitalist states' commitment to free collective bargaining. I want to tell you a story in a little bit, and I just want you to listen to the words because they keep getting repeated over and over and over again. In fact, your premier 2 weeks ago basically gave a speech in the well, she wasn't in the legislature because that wasn't important enough for her to be in the legislature for. She had left the country, but her finance minister said, listen, we don't want to do this, right? We just think it's fair that they go back to work. That's good for everybody, but in particular them. So the commitment, we believe in collective bargaining, but not in this particular case. And that's something that Panish and Swartz noticed in 1984 and has increasingly become a pattern. In fact, if you look at the first time the federal government introduced back to work legislation in 1951, that speech could have been written verbatim for the finance minister in the Alberta legislature 2 weeks ago in 2025. And I'm going to tell you that story if I have time. I'm keeping an eye on my phone, so if I've run out of time, we can talk about it later. So what they were noticing was a criminalization of workers' ability to freely withdraw their labor, like literal criminalization. Trade union leaders were literally being put in jail for just defending their rights to collectively bargain and to strike. And what was unique, I think, about that analysis was the author's historical observation that the erosion of so-called free collective bargaining was itself contradictory, because the state had already restrained workers' collective freedoms through various legal restrictions on their ability to withdraw their labor. Right? So if you're a trade union leader or a union member and you want to go on strike, well, you can't just go on strike, right? You have to go into bargaining. You have to declare an impasse. You have to declare a cooling off period. You have to then go through probably some form of conciliation or mediation. You then have to wait a bit longer. And then you have to go back and so on and so forth. It's all kinds of restrictions already. Nobody in Canada, no labor leader in Canada, can freely strike the way perhaps maybe they once could. So what they were saying was what was occurring in the 1970s, 1980s was an even greater restriction on those freedoms. It's already been restrained, and now it's being restrained even more. And what they called it was a form of, this is a quote, a form of selective, ad hoc, discretionary state coercion, whereby the state removes for a specific purpose in a period of time the rights contained in labor legislation. It's an emergency. We don't want to do this, but we have to because it's so vital to public health, safety, convenience, or whatever. And they called this a pattern. And here they made the novel observation that is worthy of further explanation. In fact, this is going to be, I think, the project that's going to take up all my time until I retire. That's the plan. They made this observation. They said, quote, the evolution of liberal capitalist democracies into liberal democratic societies is conventionally understood in terms of the institution of mass suffrage, end quote. So I kind of stole that from my introduction. I didn't quote it in the, actually, I'm now guilty of plagiarism. I can't believe I did that. But I quoted it now, so hopefully you'll forgive me. So while it's essential that understanding liberal democracies, they continued. However, quote, the distinction between a democratic or authoritarian capitalist regime is never only one, they argue, of voting rights. It is equally, indeed, in some cases more clearly, a distinction which rests on the absence or presence of freedom of association rights for workers, end quote. In other words, what Panish and Swartz were determining was a novel conception of what freedom is and what democracy is. What do they mean by freedom of association? At the very least, it reflected the ability of workers to freely enter into trade unions of their own choosing, which included the state's acceptance of, quote, the collective class-specific organization of labor, the trade union, as the legitimate democratic representative of workers. These organizations also had to be independent from the state and independent from the employing classes. Those individuals and organizations that represented political and economic power in capitalist societies and who historically have always resisted democratization. So I disagree a little bit with with Theo, who today talked about capitalism and democracy, but I still would happily have you marry into my family, Theo, so I'm more than happy for that to occur. So I disagree, but hopefully we can still be comrades. Freedom of association, perhaps more importantly for Panish and Swartz, reflected the freedom of workers to withdraw their labor. A free society, you should be free to withdraw your labor. Why is this important for a democracy? Well, let's start with the basic observation. We work a lot, like a lot. A huge percentage of our human time on the planet is spent at work. According to some sources, Stats Canada is the one I chose to borrow from, you'll spend, everyone in this room, some of you mostly may have already done that, most of it, On average, 96,000 hours of your life engaging in paid employment. That's roughly 13 years of your life. Add an additional 1.5 years for overtime, you're pushing into 15 years. And I'm not even going to get into housework and child rearing, which is gendered, of course. Take away sleep, you're looking at a good chunk of your life in someone else's employment. So to break it down even more, the average life expectancy, I looked this up yesterday because I didn't know if it changed. It hasn't. For men in Canada, 79.25 years. And for women, it's 83.79 years. I don't know what a 0.79 year is, but okay. Canadian men are spending 17% of their lives working, just on that rough estimate, mostly for someone else. Canadian women are spending 16% of their lives mostly working for someone else. And here's the rub, when we start digging beneath the surface, is that yes, we live in a liberal democratic society, although yes, there are pressures on that, and I agree with all the presentations I've talked about that so far. But actually, most of our lives we spend working in institutions that are not democratic, in any sense of the word. Workplaces are not democratic spaces. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone in this room, but it's worth highlighting what that means. Almost all workers have a superior who they have to obey. There's no rule of law that governs in the workplace. Yes, there are rules, yes, there are policies, yes, governments pass certain legislation, but for the most part, we live and work in a system where someone else creates the rules that we have to follow. Rules are made to be followed, and they're not made to be questioned. Rules are arbitrary and can change unexpectedly. Superiors are unaccountable. They're not elected. They choose how to manage. Superiors are only accountable to those at the top, who often have a different set of rules, if any. And rules can govern all forms of human behavior: emotion, dress, mannerisms. You know, if you work on an airline, you have to be happy all the time, apparently, or so on. Your emotions become part of the commodity. Those at the top who do not have to follow the same rules, those higher ranked officials, have fewer restrictions on their behavior. Their speech may be monitored and policed at work and outside of work. Your emails and communications can be monitored. Your washroom breaks can be monitored. Your eating breaks can be policed and regulated. You might be criticized or vulnerable at work for your choices outside of work, your personal habits, your partner or sexual preferences, whether you choose to smoke or consume alcohol, and the list goes on and on. This is the authoritarian nature of the capitalist workplace. And if you don't believe me, and you're saying, well, this guy's just a Leninist, and he's coming in preaching communism, let me quote a liberal political philosopher at, I think she's at Princeton, Elizabeth Anderson. She calls this a system of private government. Private government. It's a neat little book. I don't agree with all of it, but it's a good sort of way to think about it. It's a system of authoritarian governance, she says, that rules most of our working lives. And to challenge the system is to think about expanding democracy in the workplace and beyond. And we probably can't move fast enough if we take the notion that workers' freedom of association, freedoms designed to break or at least challenge the tyranny of employer power, is under threat. And here, I would argue, in challenging employer power, unions are engaged in a mass project of democratization. Don't take my word for it. According to Veronica Nielsen, General Secretary and Trade Union Advisory Committee of the OECD, and David Acuna, President of the Workers United Center in Chile, writing for the OECD in 2024, argue that trade unions are themselves democratic organizations, which is rare in society. And they point that out. They are democratic organizations that are rare in capitalist society. And, quote, sustain the democratic and participatory structures of a society. Here they recognize, quote, that unionism has played a central role in many democratic transitions in history, in countries as diverse as South Africa, Poland, Spain. Chilean trade unions in particular played a critical role in resisting military dictatorship and reconstructing democracy in that country. And in areas where we see real democratic backsliding, which was the topic of the conversation earlier today, in places like Hungary, Turkey, and even the United States, trade unions are increasingly weak or being actively weakened. So if you look at President Trump's attack on the National Labor Relations Board, certifications already low have gotten even lower under the Trump presidency, which is a continuation of his first term. I don't think that's an accident or done just because he doesn't like unions. I think he sees them for what they are, a threat to his project. Partially the result of authoritarian attacks from governments and capital, and partially because of broad macroeconomic shifts over the past 4 decades. Here, it's worth pointing back and coming back to Canada. We're not immune to this issue in Canada. According to the 2004 National Trade Union Confederation Global Rights Index, Canada is what they call a regular violator of workers' trade union rights in a world where 9 out of 10 countries violate the right of workers to strike, and 8 out of 10 countries deny workers the right to bargain collectively for better terms and conditions in that same year. 90% and 80% accordingly. And this is to say nothing about workers and trade union leaders who are under violent repression, or even the risk of incarceration or assassination in places like Bangladesh, Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, and the Philippines. Thus, it's vital, if we are serious about understanding how societies become democratic, or perhaps just as importantly, how we avoid democratic backsliding, or perhaps positively, how we can think about new forms of economic democratization, then I think we have to take seriously the issue of freedom of association. Much more seriously, I would argue, than we have to this point. And highlighting this point, we can argue, as critical scholars have, such as Kim Moody, Sam Gindin, and Greg Wood, that, quote, democracy is closely related to a union's capacity to mobilize and to act. Democracy, they argue, is a means for, quote, building solidarity, ensuring accountability, and devising appropriate strategies to challenge political and economic power, end quote. Well, if that's the case, why don't we recognize that attacks on trade unions are often a precursor to attacks on the democratic system itself? So often we talk about transitions to authoritarianism, and there was discussion about this morning. It was 2 excellent presentations. But, and this is a mild criticism, there's no discussion about trade unions. That's basically me saying, why don't you do what I do? Why don't you study what I study, Theo? Come on. But really, realistically, right, when you look at the map of how authoritarian societies have moved to, say, fascist societies, one of the first things they did in Italy, and one of the first things they did in Germany, one of the first things they did in Spain was attack the independence of the trade unions. Why? Well, because trade unions act as a buffer to those projects. Now, I'm going to simplify a lot here, and I will be rightfully criticized for simplifying, because unions are not homogeneous. Some are very inward-looking, me-first unions that tend to avoid taking bold political stances. Some have historically been advocates of anti-racism, building solidarity with broader NGOs and civil society representatives, expanding representation through the state, building a solid pillar of left political parties like the CCF-NDP, like the Labour Party in Britain, like the communist parties in France, and so on. Advocating for women's and LGBTQS plus rights, indigenous rights, not always, not perfectly, and sometimes in opposition. And I'm not ignorant of that fact, and I'm not trying to gloss over that fact. Some have acted in reactionary, xenophobic, sexist, homophobic ways, and we can't push that aside. We have to take that seriously. Some are very outward-looking and engaged in political debate. Some are very democratic and accountable to their members. Some are less so, and we can't ignore that fact. And let's be clear here, unions can and should be more democratic in how they function. But, and this is the challenge I would put to you, and to, the uncle that comes for dinner on Sunday and says unions are terrible. It's like, well, let me ask you this. Here's the response I would challenge you to say. I don't know why it's always the uncle. Could be someone else, I guess. But they are and continue to be, I think, one of the most democratic institutions in capitalist society. What is a more democratic institution in society right now than a trade union in civil society? Give me an example. There might be, but there's not a lot. And it's certainly not the workplace, where we spend most of our time, as we've already decided. So all unions of workers have something that few organizations in society have. They have the institutional and material capacity to challenge economic and political power. And that is the hope for workers and fear for governments and employers. That's why employers oppose unions in the workplace. It's not just about the bottom line. It's also about control and power and influence. There are also institutions of egalitarianism, working to redistribute wealth through collective bargaining and political advocacy, that is at its roots about expanding the economic pie, not restricting it. Yes, sometimes imperfectly, and yes, sometimes only for their own members. I was at a golf course over the summer. It was a public course, before you judge me. And I golfed with this old trade union guy, and he's like, I'm not one of those social justice union guys. I look out for my own. And that's when I'm like, I think I'm going to go join this party over there. So obviously that's an attitude we need to think about. So we're not romanticizing unions in the way that they're all perfect. But we have to take seriously that they are institutions of egalitarianism in as much as they try and redistribute wealth. There's only 2 ways to redistribute wealth in a capitalist society. Taxation, redistribution through taxation, and collective bargaining. Right? So if we limit those, then we become a less egalitarian society. And a less egalitarian society tends to be a less democratic one, in my argument. So to return to the arguments first raised by Panish and Swartz, then the now regular ad hoc restrictive measures of back-to-work legislation occurring with regular frequency, which I don't have to tell anyone in this audience about, that have become so frequent that it's safe to say that Panish's and Swartz's innovative concept of permanent exceptionalism, which is a brilliant contradiction, had become the new norm for all workers whose strike action threatens the power of capital or the state in any given historical moment, or at this point just becomes inconvenient for the state. What was particularly novel about this concept, I would argue, and why the article, I think, remains a foundational text in the scholarship of Canadian labour history, political economy, and labour studies. I did a short, quick look across the journal that I edit, Labour Le Travail, which is, I would argue, is the foremost labour studies journal in Canada. No offense to the members of CIRA here who have their industrial relations journal. I hope I'm not being too rude by saying that. Is that the authors were cited more than 200 times in our journal alone. It's just a book that people continuously go back to. Why? I would argue it's because they identify the contradictory manner by which the use of back-to-work legislation by Canadian governments was, quote, continually portrayed as exceptional, temporary, emergency-related, regardless of how frequently they occurred, or the number of workers who fell within their scope or were threatened by their example, end quote. And today, the way governments are eroding the rights of workers to strike seems to be being massaged. And here I was obligated to cite Barniston, Foster, and Cake. Jason said you have to cite me if you want to come to this conference. I was like, okay, Jason, I can do that. It includes increasingly restricting the ability of public sector workers to strike by designating them essential, restricting union abilities to collect union dues for broad political purposes, which has happened here in Alberta, which is a form of right-to-work legislation, utilizing government bargaining mandates, utilizing labor institutions like the Canadian Industrial Relations Board to read in sections of the Labor Code to unilaterally end strikes, as we witnessed with the postal workers and Canada workers, railway workers, and others. Taken as a whole, what these events show is we can recognize that since the 1950s, and with increasing frequency since the 1970s, the so-called temporary and exceptional nature of these orders are no longer temporary or exceptional. In 2025, it stands at over 150 separate occurrences since 1950. Represents something more than temporary or ad hoc. It's increasingly clear that governments are willing to balance the rights of workers with a looming political or economic emergency, real or imagined, within the specific regime of capitalistic. Patterns are this. In the 1970s, back-to-work legislation became the state's blunt hammer to discipline Canadian workers and weaken resistance to the otherwise violent process of neoliberalization. Violent in as much as labor leaders were thrown in jail for just not going back to work. Why would a worker not go back to work be thrown in jail? Right? Because they're challenging the state's restrictive capacities. These restrictions weaken workers' abilities to challenge broad macroeconomic changes designed to squeeze workers' capacities to fight for higher wages, to challenge the anti-inflation fights in the early 70s and early 1980s. They were equally effective in the weakening of the ability of teachers or nurses to challenge imposed austerity within the public sector through the 1990s and 2000s. And here we get into a little bit of, I think, some things that need to be worked through. So the Canadian labour movement roughly is about 30% of the labour force in Canada. But it's 70% of the unionized labour force is in the public sector. That's not new, I'm sure you all know that. Less and less workers in the private sector are in a union. That in and of itself is a problem. But in the public sector, you then have to go up against the government, who plays a dual role. They are both the employer and the legislature. They see their mandate as one, defending the entire society. Workers become a subsection of that, especially the unionized force. It's why new democratic governments often get themselves in the hot water when they go up against their unions, because they don't see past the fact that they don't want to raise taxes either, and they can never really been able to iron out that contradiction, as Mr. Eby in BC found out recently when he fought the BCGEU for 4 weeks on strike. Nevertheless, the public sector workers have become the thin edge of the wedge of the state's blunt back-to-work legislation, which we saw in Alberta 2 weeks ago. And I'll get into that in a second. So effective have the state's coercive measures become that the overall thesis was demonstrated by none other than one of the country's foremost leaders defenders of trade union freedoms. In its history, Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper. No, I'm kidding. That was a joke, by the way. There wasn't many laughs. They're like, wait, I was with you and then now I'm not. What's going on there? When in defending his decision to legislate Air Canada workers back to work in 2012, he made this assertion. Now, this could be right out of Panich and Swartz's book. Quote, "I'll be darned if we will now sit by and let the airline shut itself down. Under these circumstances at the present time, this is not what the economy needs, and it is certainly not what the traveling public needs at this time of year." I think it was the spring. "As much as there's a side of me that doesn't want or like to do this, I think these actions are essential to keep the airline flying and to make sure the two parties find some way through mediation or arbitration of resolving these disputes without having any impacts on the Canadian public." End quote. I don't want to do this. I really don't have any choice. The public needs to be protected. That's the playbook. Harper's position resonated the now consistent pattern of governments that recognize the legitimacy of workers' collective bargaining rights to strike, yet act in direct way to undermine any pretext supporting that model when it challenges the political or economic policies of accumulation championed by governments and capitalists. Harper's government did not shy away from championing its anti-union animus. They just didn't like labor unions and labor leaders. But the present-day concoction of reactionary conservative represents a crude form of now decades-old pattern of the capitalist state undermining core labor freedoms in this country, but elsewhere. When worker actions threaten or challenge dominant patterns of accumulation. And there's no political party in this country that is immune from using this instrument. We've seen it with conservatives, we've seen it with liberals, and we have seen it with New Democrats. Although, conservatives tend to use it more, liberals a little less, but lots, and New Democrats a little less, not as much. That's the generalization. I don't have all the numbers in front of me, but that's generally how it works. And I don't have to tell you about the recent actions by the other Smith, is government. I don't have a government. I have students who basically tune me out. But UCP legislating teachers back to work on the backs of the 2015 Supreme Court decision, which said that the right to strike and bargain were constitutional. The Smith government, recognizing that there was a real chance they were going to lose if it went to arbitration, they probably would have. They couldn't impose a bargaining mandate on the arbitrator. That would have been clearly unconstitutional, as court after court after court has shown in the last 5 years. You cannot impose restrictions on the arbitration if you want to go to bargaining arbitration. That will be unconstitutional, so the Smith government said, heck with it. We're not going to do that. We're just going to legislate it back and you can't challenge it. Here's a new agreement, by the way, that you just rejected. I think that runs it up in about a nutshell. Yeah. And it was interesting, if you read the speech in your Alberta legislature by the finance minister, whose name eludes me at the moment. Him, right? I did read it, right? He said, we don't want to do this. We prefer negotiated settlements. But we believe in democracy and fairness. And they have to go back. Those are not direct quotes, right? I was pulling it out. Right? And perhaps I'm guilty of taking it out of context. But that's what he said in the legislature. I would have quoted Danielle Smith, but again, she decided that she had to leave the country. So is that a fair criticism? I think it's a fair criticism. So the reality is that by weakening trade union freedoms, as Harper, Smith, Trudeau, and Carney, and countless others have, Romano would be an example of the New Democratic premier who legislated nurses back to work, they are undermining the ability of workers to shape their own workplaces, to challenge the authoritarian manner in which workplaces are run, and to break down the institutional barriers of what Anderson calls private government. We've witnessed it in Canada, we've witnessed it in Alberta, we've witnessed it in Saskatchewan, we've witnessed it in British Columbia. Really, I could just name them all. It's crude, it's a blunt attempt to end workers' freedoms association rights across the political spectrum. So this is part of a project I've started about a year ago, looking at the notion of trade unions and democracy, which was what the title of my talk alluded to. And I'm working on this as a larger book project, which I'm really hoping will be something worth reading. But there's 4 points I want to sort of flesh out, but only 2 are kind of relevant to what I've said so far and what I'll conclude with. I think all 4 points that I'm going to give to you need to be theorized and empirically chronicled as part of this project, both historically and comparatively. But here's the 4 points that is guiding this project. 1, to understand how and why democracies thrive, fail, weaken, or backslide, we need to have a better understanding of how trade unions function, how and why workers form unions, and how democratic those unions are in relationship to their membership. So that's point one. Two, that there is a strong correlation between strong and healthy trade unions and democratic societies more broadly, which is not something that's common in the democratic literature. In my discipline, I confess, a political scientist, not a sociologist or a trained historian, although I pretend to be an historian. That often when we talk about democratization, unions are an afterthought at best or a variable in a broader list of NGOs. I think that's a mistake, and I think it needs to be thought more concretely in the center of what a democratic society is. The weaker trade unions is the hypothesis, the more prone democratic societies are to backsliding. The stronger trade unions are, the more likelihood of a strong democratic society is the argument. In short, the freer and democratic the trade union, the freer and democratic the society. That's the argument of the project. Whether or not Shirk will want to fund that, I'm still waiting to hear. But I actually think there's some strong superficial evidence to describe that. I'm looking forward to digging into it more. The governments and employers, this is the third point, and this is what I've been talking about. The governments and employers in Canada have undermined the core rights of workers to collectively bargain and strike since the 1950s, and that the ability of this to occur is actually a fundamental feature of Canada's industrial relations system, and it itself is losing legitimacy. That's the third point. The fourth, and the acceleration of government assault on trade union freedoms, is undermining and weakening Canadian democracy. That's the fourth point. The answer to the last two questions lies firmly in the Canadian state's long history of regulating workers' collective action in manners that rely on all actors buying into the system. So that's the legitimacy part. We'll create a system, it'll benefit you a little bit, it'll benefit the employer a little bit. You're not going to always get what you want, but you all see legitimacy in the system. But it also exists alongside this increasingly coercive role in undermining the very system by ending the rights embedded in the system when workers' struggles challenge the system. That's a lot of the term system in the same sentence, but you get my point. That the system, as we saw in Alberta a few weeks ago. Now, was Smith wrong because she used the notwithstanding clause? Yes. Was Smith wrong because she uses a heavy hand to solve her problems without negotiating with LGBT communities, with labor unions, with teachers, with professionals? They just passed the Jordan Peterson bill, which I won't even get into. I'm not going to get into that. I want to so much to get into that, but I won't, because nobody needs to hear me rant. This is prepared, and I'm not a rant. But I think she's wrong because she sees collective bargaining as a threat, and treating workers with any respect is a threat to her larger political project. So what is unique about Canada's regulation of labor relations is that both the ability of workers to bargain and to strike are specifically and narrowly defined by the capitalist state. And in looking at this history, and this is what I want to end with in the last 15 or 20 minutes, I want to take you back in time to 1950, the first time back-to-work legislation was introduced. And that permanent exceptionalism became the concept that guided Panish and Schwartz's analysis that continues to shape the discipline today. And in that context, there's a deference to public emergencies and temporary restrictions on legal rights that became very comfortable for Canadian governments and that built into the foundation of Canada's current system of industrial relations. All of this demonstrates that back-to-work legislation in all its forms is the sharp edge of the wedge when it comes to how governments treat workers' collective freedoms. Moreover, how labor responds to these attacks in the current moment will shape the institution going forward. Now, I'm not a cushy academic well, I am, but I'm not going to get up and stand and say to labor union leaders or to workers that you have to strike more. That's the answer, because that's not what I'm arguing. But when core collective freedoms, like your ability to bargain and to strike, become irrelevant, then the trade union itself is weakened. And when a trade union is weakened, democratic pressures are easier to erode. Because trade unions, I think, are at the sort of front line of defending democracy, is my argument. So without a strong defense of their core functions, we run into problems. But ultimately, that's built into the system, so we need to think about it. Okay, so I'm going to give you like a quick 150-year history lesson in 10 minutes. I can do this. Just don't take notes, because you won't be able to write this fast. So it shouldn't be a surprise that this is part of the system if you've been studying labor history for more than 15 minutes at any level. Throughout the 19th century, the law constructed numerous criminal boundaries around workers' strike action. Some of these were formally removed in 1872, but because they're conservatives said, we'll take away that, and we'll pass something else that makes it harder for you to strike. It was a brilliant sort of sleight of hand. That was not Donald MacDonald, it was John A. Macdonald and his Tories. But they made alliances with the male, so certain segments of the male working class, with the police, and employer violence on picket lines became common. They were routinely utilized to break worker strikes in expanding areas of so-called non-skilled workers, especially when those actions proved threatening to the political and economic order. And I'm going to fast forward from 1872 to 1944, just like that. But the process of violent coercion was certainly demonstrated, most famously in the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike, where we saw workers murdered for marching, being on strike. That struggle was only the most sensational in a long history of state repression and violence that characterized strike activity in Canada before World War II. And it is around World War II that the regime of industrial relations that we now know, and I was going to say love, but that would be wrong, that we now tolerate, was created. Not all strikes in the pre-1944 period challenged the pillars of the capitalist economy or threatened to undermine the powers of the state. Some erupted in violence, many others did not. But when workers demanded recognition in industries where capitalists refused steadfastly to deal with the union, the state or employer violence always loomed in the background in any dispute. And a system like that can't claim to be democratic, right? If it's just about forming a union and you're supporting the parties that's not doing it, how can you claim otherwise? So after unprecedented strike activity during the war, Second World War, it pushed the state to recognize the basic freedoms that we would understand as trade unionists or people sympathetic to trade unionists today. Pushed the state to recognize the laws, basic freedoms for workers, state restrictions on collective activity took new forms, but Panish and Swartz argue equally restrictive. The center of this new regime was an industrial system which turned away from open coercion and replaced with mediated and structured legal processes that put legal rights at the center of the collective bargaining process. To accept this new state bargain, no pun intended, the state formulated collective bargaining, and it came with equally competing demands for unions and workers to act responsibly and respect the ability of capital to accumulate. That implied that workers had to accept restrictions on their basic rights. The right to withdraw their labor could only occur in certain moments in time. It couldn't happen, right, when Quinn gets disciplined in the workplace, and I like Quinn, so I'm like, everybody out! We are going to defend Quinn until he gets his job back. Well, that's illegal in Canada. It wasn't illegal in 1943, but it was illegal in 1944. Why? Because we accepted that there was now a process that we would call a labor lawyer and be like, hey, Mr. Labor Lawyer, Mrs. Labor Lawyer, come and follow a mediation or arbitration grievance to defend Quinn. Right? And we'll figure it out in a year from now, and an arbitrator can figure it out. Right? That was the bargain. I'm simplifying a lot here, but you get my point. Workers had to restrict abilities on their collective rights to withdraw their labor, which included a ban on you can't have political strikes, you can't have recognition strikes, you can't have mid-contract strikes. Those will all be illegal. Well, what do you get in return by agreeing to that? Well, you get recognition. You get a process of organization and a labor board that will certify you, that you then have to be recognized by the employer. You get a process of collective bargaining. You get a process where you can withdraw your labor at specific times in specific moments. And you don't get the thugs at the factory line saying, don't join a union or be blacklisted, or you'll be assaulted, or whatever. But it is a contradiction. You had to give something up to get something. What Panish and Swartz said, and this is one of my favorite quotes in their book, is like before, it was the appearance of the charge of the Mounties to stop workers from doing what workers want to do to challenge their employer. Now, you take the rule of law by which unions police themselves in most instances. If you don't want to defend Quinn by going on strike, if you do, well, it's not going to be the boss that's going to tell you to go back to work. It's going to be the labor leader telling you to go back to work because we have a deal. We have a system, we have a process. So it's built in. There's a quid pro quo built into the system. All of this is to say, right, the system itself is highly restricted and highly regulated and already really restricts workers' collective abilities. That's the bargain. That's the quid pro quo. But what happens when the state gives up on the bargain? That's the question I think we have to ask ourselves. When the state says the bargain's no longer working for us, and you can't actually legally strike because it's inconvenient to us and we don't like it, well, what's the point of the system if that bargain is not, yes, well, don't attack me. I'm just the messenger. So yes, strikes occurred in the post-war period, but the legal boundaries, the quid pro quo, included mandated strike votes. Strike action was further delayed by both sides. Declared legal impasse had to occur before legal strikes could occur. Once these steps were taken, workers were then required to participate in compulsory conciliation in most jurisdictions, mandatory cooling off periods, and so on. No labor leader in Canada, historically, since this period, could be accused of striking recklessly. It's just institutionally extremely difficult. Yet maybe there are examples, but for the most part, that was what the system was designed to do: contain class struggle. Now, I have a whole section about going into the Cold War. I'm not going to do that. Most of my students don't even know what the Cold War is. I have to explain to them. Some of you might have lived through it. But that Cold War chill also played a role. I'll just leave it at that. And it wasn't until the 1960s when a new generation of workers started pushing back against this, with some successes and some failures, that we saw sort of the contradictions laid bare. And then certainly in the 1970s. So with the last 10 minutes I have, let me tell you the story of the first time back-to-work legislation became used, and see if it sounds familiar. So it occurred in 1950, and the Prime Minister at the time was a Liberal, which is pretty much what you can say of the 20th century. A guy named Louis St. Laurent. He was the first to use the back-to-work legislation on the 30th of August in 1950. And it was based on a quid pro quo with the unions involved. But in this dispute, 17 separate railway unions and telegraph unions representing about 125,000 workers walked off the job after failing to successfully bargain for improved wages and expanding union membership, including the hotel and water employees who were in the hotels of the railway companies. But what they really were looking for was a 40-hour work week. So the 40-hour work week is pretty much the norm these days, but up until the 1950s, it was still not common, which the company was refusing to budge on. Also health and safety, which if you ever follow railway disputes, that's still an issue. It's actually an issue at every railway dispute. But lots of infighting between the unions. Some of the big names in Canadian labour were involved. A guy named Aaron Mosher was the president of the Canadian Brotherhood of Railway Workers. I'm not going to go into that too much. Lots of fighting with the communist unions who were tied into the electrical side, but I'm not going to go into that. But this was the largest strike in Canadian history up till that point. It's also at the beginning of a small military conflict that was breaking out in Korea at the time, which Canada participated in. So in fact, the day the strike was called, every news, and I've read most of them, all the newspapers were filled with fear-mongering stories of communities in the north starving. This is the day the strike was called. So, maybe you could write that a month from then, but the day of, warnings of mass layoffs across the country was going to destroy the economy. And the typical bemoaning of unions abusing the strike weapon to punish the general public. That was the quote from the Minister of Labour. But the unions were also quick to point out the Liberal government's interference in the working conditions of the railway workers and accused the government of siding with the railway companies. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that was the case. But to his credit, St. Laurent did try to broker a solution, himself getting involved in the negotiations, which I was trying to think if I could imagine Justin Trudeau or Stephen Harper or Mark Carney actually getting involved directly in negotiations with a union and an employer today, and I find that hard to imagine. But St. Laurent rolled up his sleeves, got into the bargaining room, which to his credit, he failed, but it was interesting to think that a sitting prime minister would actually do that, which I couldn't imagine Daniel Smith sitting at the bargaining table with the teachers union. But maybe that wouldn't be good for anybody. Anyway, okay. So even though that happened, it didn't work. And once the strike started, immediately the threat of a back-to-work bill was raised. And it was introduced by St. Laurent himself. So unlike Smith, he actually did introduce the bill and defend it in Parliament. To his credit? I don't know, maybe, whatever, however we want to find out. St. Laurent outlined his government's reasonings for intervening in this strike and reinforced how and why the state had to end this legal strike. And that's important, it was legal. They were following the rules. And here's what he said: despite claiming allegiance to the principles of collective bargaining and the legal institutions which have proven their value to the national economy of Canada, my government has no choice but to, quote, deal with what amounts to a national emergency. Sound familiar? St. Laurent insisted that his government was not intending to intervene in the process of collective bargaining because he supported collective bargaining between two equal powers and recognized that, quote, the strike had not been in violation of any law, but that in situations of national emergency, even the most sacred of, quote, normally private rights at times amount to what becomes public wrongs. In such an instance, St. Laurent elaborated, the ability of workers to bargain and strike freely may inflict, quote, an injury that the insistence on private rights made due to the public is sometimes so great that it has to be given serious consideration because the existence and security of the state is the first and prior consideration for each and every one of us, end quote. That's pretty heavy language. In other words, without the railway, we can't function as a society. They have to go back to work. And he imposed binding arbitration. And they eventually did get the 40-hour work week. In fact, the next day on the pages of the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, Mosher and the other labor leader were saying, this is great for us. The communist labor unions were less impressed with this grand bargain. And it was interesting, too. So in the lead up to the vote, the Canadian government mobilized the Canadian military to fly all the MPs back to Ottawa to vote on this bill, which the symbolism to me is interesting. Now, of course, it's worth remembering that there was an act of war about to start, so they were mobilized already, but the emergency for the government was clear. The only voice of opposition was the Social Democrats in Parliament and in Saskatchewan. Now, I didn't include this just to have Saskatchewan content, because this is Alberta, and we get forgotten about sometimes on the prairies, and I understand it. Scott Moe is also annoying in Saskatchewan, too, not just in Alberta. Is that giving too much away? I probably shouldn't say it that so brilliant. Okay, but here's what Tommy Douglas said, and it's actually interesting. The introduction, quote, of the principle of compulsory arbitration, so that was what their solution was going to be. We're going to send to arbitration and let an arbitrator decide. Shows how far, he said, we have drifted from democratic procedures in Canada. Collective bargaining is now to be replaced by binding 150,000 workers to the decision of one individual from whose ruling there is no appeal. This may make the Employers Association and the Manufacturers Association happy, but it will cause great concern to those who believe in the democratic right of workers to bargain collectively, end quote. Yeah. See, it's good Saskatchewan content, right? You're all happy now. That's the first time it was ever used, and there's a lot of story that I didn't tell. But really, what does that tell us? It tells us a lot about how the state sees labor and its ability to withdraw its work. It sees it as a crisis. It sees it as an emergency. Now, not every strike is an emergency. Not every strike is going to be legislated back to work. That's not the claim. But when it becomes a problem, governments in Canada are free to end that right. And we see that time and time and over and over. I have more, but I'm going to end on this. As we see these blunt actions of the state in legislating, legally striking workers back to work, as we saw 2 weeks ago in Alberta, we have to understand it as an attack on democratic freedoms and the ability of workers to freely bargain. I think that's straightforward. But the next question then is, if it's an attack on our democratic freedoms, at what point does it become an attack on democracy itself? As strikes continue, and they will, governments will increasingly use this tool when it becomes a problem for them. So at what point do we recognize that the system that has governed industrial relations since 1944 is increasingly being undermined by the governments who defend it? That's the question we have to answer. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for that great talk. We're going to open up to questions.
Yes, thank you very much. It was very interesting. My question is, if 70% of our employees are of the unions are employed by the government, they're having to share the taxpayer dollars. One of the assets you have and powers that you have as unions is to educate a sector of the population that not many other organizations have access to. It's one of your many powers that you have that most of us don't have. So it's one that really needs to be acknowledged. How are you educating your members about the effects of defense spending on whether they're going to get part of that taxpayer dollars for their wages and their bills?
Well, I mean, it's interesting when you look at a lot of public sector strike. Well, first off, it's not always just public sector strikes. Like at the federal level, those are private companies, right? So Canada Post, Canada Rail, Air Canada, and so on. But yes, so the teachers, right? They derive their money from the public coffers. But when you look at the center of those disputes, are wages always at the center of these disputes? Well, sometimes, but not always, right? And the other part of it is that a lot of public sector unions are the first to take cuts and austerity when government's trying to balance their budgets. What I would say is, like, if you have that problem and that issue, right, that's an issue for the bargaining table, right? It's not an issue for legislation sending them back to work, in my view, right? And if you can't figure it out, then let them fight it out on the picket line, right? But that's what the process is supposed to do, right? So I can't say the government should just raise taxes, although you should have a sales tax in Alberta, by the way, right? But I'm not saying you should just raise taxes. But what I am saying is that you shouldn't be able to just end negotiations because it's inconvenient to you.
I mean, your job as union leaders is to educate those members.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Sure, absolutely, right? And that makes the union itself more democratic. I agree. Yes, absolutely.
Thanks for the wonderful talk. Oftentimes when governments legislate people back to work, they consider them essential workers. In my opinion, all workers are essential workers. Any comment on essential workers being a defining thing that the government uses?
Yeah, sure. It's an excellent point. And what we've seen since the 1990s is more and more governments are designating more and more workers in the public sector essential. I think there is a legitimate discussion around certain sectors of the economy that probably shouldn't be able to withdraw their labor. I think ambulance drivers are probably the perfect example of that. But what's interesting in most of those sectors, most of those workers actually don't want or haven't been calling for a right to strike, but they do demand to be taken seriously at the bargaining table. Firefighters might be another. We could debate police and others, but so beyond those, like, emergency services, we had a strike in Saskatchewan in 1999 against the NDP government. Nurses walked out, and nurses were well aware, right, about their role and their place in the healthcare system and maintain levels of service. I guess the answer to your question is that why do we not trust workers to actually understand their responsibilities as well as governments? Because we don't do that. But in Saskatchewan, what we've seen is a government that was determined to make a broad swath of workers essential. In fact, I was considered essential as a university professor. Now, I like to think I'm important, but like if I don't teach next week, my students might not even be annoyed. They might be okay with that. But if an ambulance driver doesn't show up or a firefighter doesn't show up, well, that's a whole different ballgame. So I think there's legitimate room to have, and of course the Saskatchewan government lost that case, and that's why there's a constitutional right to bargain, because they tried to take away unilaterally the rights of workers to bargain around this issue. So it has been used as a weapon, and I think we have to be cautious with it. Absolutely.
I'm part of a private sector union in Vancouver where we had a safe harbor agreement imposed upon us about 15 years ago. Essentially, it removes our ability to strike whatsoever, even in times of between being contracts. We spent about 15 years appealing that against the labor board. What is to prevent any kind of labor board from imposing safe harbor agreements? It's the entertainment industry. It's the film technicians union.
Yeah.
Not essential in any way, shape, and form.
Yeah.
But the labor board imposed a safe harbor agreement to prevent us from striking, and we are the only jurisdiction in North America in the entertainment industry who's not allowed to strike.
Safe harbor?
It's called a safe harbor agreement. It's a good case of study if you've never heard of it.
And we've been
appealing it, the labor board there in BC for some time, and they just keep kicking it down the can because they think it's essential to keeping American investment in the industry there, and that's what it is. It's American investment. How do you stop a labor board from imposing something like a safe harbor agreement?
I don't know. But here's what I would say. So it sounds very similar to what the Canadian Industrial Relations Board has been doing with its interpretation of Section 107. It's not obviously not the same, but it sounds similar, right? Where they're kind of reading this section that was never designed to be used in the way the minister's been using it, legislating workers back to work, Air Canada workers, railway workers. Cup W was legislated back using this weird provision. So what happened was the airline workers eventually said, we're just not going to go back. At that point, the minister balked, right? Because he's like, oh, we don't actually have a tool now to repose you because we don't have a piece of legislation that can fine you or throw you in jail, right? He balked, and they pulled back that order. So I'm not saying you should strike illegally and fight it, but right, I think it's going to take sustained organization in your institution to come up with a solution. So either it's a court challenge saying your constitutional rights are being violated. That's one way. Another way is to mobilize your membership and talk about, right, the fact that you have rights and you're being undermined by this board decision. From what you're saying, I actually don't know I'm curious about can you please, let me know, I'd love to know more, yeah.
My name's Thomas. I'm a member of the executive board for United Nurses of Alberta. I think your topic of why worker freedom of association is essential to democracy is incredibly topical, given the attacks that are happening on the freedom of association, such as back to work orders. And I'm going to contradict you a little bit, because you said you don't necessarily go on illegal strikes. I support illegal strikes if they're necessary.
Yeah.
How do we mobilize, educate, convince our members to defy quote unquote legal orders like back to work legislation when it's a direct erosion of those rights?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, and there's no easy answer to that question. But here's what I would say, right, is that the unions that have the most engaged membership tend to be the ones that have the ability to educate their members in really progressive ways. If you have a union that is internally not as democratic, not as accountable to its membership, it's much harder, right, to convince the members that they themselves are part of the organization and part of the goals of the union. So when you look at the literature on union democracy, the ones who tend to be the most militant are the ones with the most engaged membership, right? So the challenge, I think, isn't to say, let's just go on illegal strike, right? And I'm not against that argument in issues like if the teachers had stayed out in Alberta, I think they had a pretty strong argument to stay out on the picket line, right? Like even just, not just morally, not just ethically, but politically and legally, I think they had a pretty good case. And they may have lost. That, I think, would have been a fight worth fighting given the circumstances 2 weeks ago. I think it's harder now. So, but I think when we look at it's gonna be the unions that are most engaged with their membership, whose members see themselves in the union and see that that struggle's worth fighting, right? So the more democratic, the more accountable you are to your members, the more likelihood you have of building that solidarity in your union. So I guess that's the challenge, right? How do you make your union, how do you like every member in the union see themselves in that struggle? That's the challenge, I think.
I'm a retired teacher with a daughter who struck. The support for the teachers in Calgary it's the first rally I realized I didn't have to go to. There were so many people. But what I need to understand is that they didn't have any strike pay. And when I was a teacher and we struck in Calgary, we had strike pay. What happened that the ATA in a province as rich as Alberta had no strike pay for those teachers? Because it would have kept them out if they had had any money coming in.
Yeah, I don't know the internal workings of the ATA, but I did hear that too. I read that, I think in the CBC, they were talking to some teachers who didn't have it. I think that's a failure of planning on the teachers union. This strike was a long time coming. So the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation had the same issue, and they refused to put their members on a picket line, and they hold one-day rallies, and they kept going back to work, and then holding one-day rallies and going back to work in their legal strike position. I'm not saying that was a good strategy, but it was for the same reasons, because they didn't have a well-defined strike pay system. They didn't have a strike account. They hadn't prepared for a full-out strike. And that contrasts with the BCTF, who has been the most strike-prone teachers union in the country, probably since the 1970s. And I'm not saying that just because my parents were teachers in BC in the 1970s and 80s, but I do know that they have a well-regulated, well-managed strike fund. I do wonder why they don't and why they haven't planned for it, knowing this fight was coming. Maybe there's teachers who could tell us in the room.
So one of the things I've noticed about the conference today and last night, there's a lot of discussion about workers' rights and capital. I don't actually feel like any of us are being located in a position. And so my question, I guess, to you, but also to the conference, is are we workers or are we the elite? And how do we actually start to embed that in these conversations so these are practical, tangible things that are about our lives as opposed to this ongoing theoretical discussion where people are frustrated because tangible action is always the next step, but that next step never arrives?
It's an excellent point.
I do want to very quickly respond to what this woman asked over here. I actually have a friend who's a teacher, and I was asking her about it because I was very confused at the notion of no strike pay. The way she explained it to me is that the union chose not to create a strike fund. I believe the year she told me was 2008, because they chose to provide benefits instead, as if you can't do both. My question for you is, it's actually similar to a question I asked yesterday at the keynote, essentially about wildcats, because the government will restrict when we're allowed to strike, when we're allowed to protest, until it decides otherwise, through such agreements. My question is, when we talk about something like a wildcat, the government will say, oh, we're going to fine all of you for $50,000 a day or whatever. I don't think most members need to worry about that, because if 55,000 people strike, the government can't, like that's never going to hold. 55,000 people just walk, and then the government says, okay, you're all in debt for $1 million. And then when they eventually do go back to the table, they say, not until you remove those fees. Yep. But the issue is that the people in leadership positions get arrested. The government essentially turns them into martyrs. And the people in those leadership positions get scared. And I don't blame them for it. I am also a firm believer in, yes, we need to strike illegally, because those are the strikes that actually make a change. Those are the strikes that actually make a difference. But what do we do when there's such a resistance to striking, and they have the ability to, because unions nowadays, unfortunately, just don't operate at a grassroots movement as often as we would like them to. Yep. The leaders have influence, and the leaders will not say, okay, we're going to go on wildcat, because then that leader will get arrested. How are we supposed to have negotiations of any kind when we just don't have the means to do it at a democratic level anymore?
Right, so 2 points of the talk that I was curious about. One is unions in democratic society, and then how we make democratic unions, right? And those are two different debates, and both equally need to be explored. I would challenge you a little bit on the notion of like, well, we'll just go out and not worry about the fines. And I'm not saying we shouldn't, but the labor board does have the capacity to monitor every worker who's in a collective bargaining relationship and is empowered to actually collect those fines. And there is evidence in other strikes that they have. So I'm not saying that to not do those things, but I'm saying that there are ways that the state has to collect fines if they so choose, even in a large strike as you're suggesting. So it's not an unlimited risk, as my point, right? There is a risk involved. Having said that, your point's well taken. Unions that are better mobilized, more democratic, well organized, have brought their membership to the table, engage in some of the things like Jean McAlevy's Organizing for Change, right? Her strategies around how unions build, right? Collective power, right? Those strikes that she talks about in Organizing to Win, so those strategies are about bringing more members to the table, right? And seeing themselves in their collective bargaining struggles. Those are strategies worth exploring if we want to build the momentum for a strike like you're talking about.
My name's Dean. I'm an organizer with the International Migrants Alliance. I've noticed like a large shift by employers to exploit the precarious nature of the migrant workforce. Yeah. So bearing in mind that trade unions' leverage lies in their numbers, is there a willingness to extend membership to the migrant workers, essentially?
My understanding of that program and how that is monitored by the government is extremely exploitative. It's extremely precarious. And unions have not been successful in breaking into those workers, into their organizations. Some for trying, but some for lack for trying. And then there's a lot of independent organizing from really dedicated organizers like yourself, right, who are working outside the union system, or the existing unions, and creating your own. I think this is a massive failure of the farm labor unions for not being engaged in that discussion, or at least not being engaged more, because that precarious workforce is some of the most exploited labor in the country. And it's sanctioned by the Canadian government. So I think that's a massive problem, and I think the unions need to be at that table. Not the elites in the union, but those workers themselves. And the other barrier, of course, is citizenship, right? When you don't have citizenship, you're more vulnerable. The only institution that can protect against that in the workforce are labor unions, right? So I think they just need to be at the table. And it needs to be driven by those workers, not by, more numbers in the union.
Thanks so much for the interesting talk and discussion. I have a couple questions. First of all, why is there often a disconnect between a union's support for labor parties and how the workers themselves are actually voting? I think we saw it with Tommy Douglas. We see it now. We see how Pierre Poilievre was able to bring workers into the Conservative Party. And the second question is, what is the best way to fight against strike regulations? Is it through collective bargaining? For example, with UNA, it's built into the collective agreement that we cannot strike outside of negotiations. Is the best way to look at those through the collective bargaining process?
So thanks for the question. So on the second part of your question, it's actually yes. The answer is yes. And we can go into more detail, but I'll leave it at that for now. On the first question, that is the million-dollar labor politics question that no one's ever been able to answer correctly, not without trying. So there's a huge body of literature that's done all kinds of quantitative survey data looking at why union members don't vote for labor parties, which probably other people in the room know better than me. But what we do know is that union members tend to want information but not be told how to vote. And so when labor leaders in the union say you have to vote for the NDP and here's why, workers tend to get pretty hostile to that. But what they do tend to support are, here's a bunch of information, there's an election coming up, how do we mobilize for an election? I think I'm sounding like a broken wheel, but the more you can mobilize and engage your membership, where they can see themselves in the struggles that they're engaged with, the more likelihood you have of building a political coalition, whether it's the NDP or the Greens or a more radical political movement, right? But the leader standing up at a meeting saying, vote NDP and here's why, has never worked. And on the Poilievre thing, that's interesting. He has made some successful inroads into some unionized workforces. But I emphasize the some. You look at the data, it's mostly white men in trades and construction where they've made the most inroads. They haven't been successful in organizing the face of the organized working class, which is women. The Canadian labor movement is dominated by women, almost 60% is women. That's not where he's making gains. So there's been some successes, but not as much as the media, I think, talks about. And that's not to ignore it, but it definitely hasn't been the swath that they talk about.
So I wanted to ask something in relation to what my friend from the International Migrant Alliance actually asked, was labor unions have ultimately failed in many instances in reaching out to migrant communities, especially temporary foreign workers, and really building those bridges with communities that have often been neglected from the labor movement. And I'm wondering, what can labor unions do? Is there something along the lines of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers with their building bridges with gig workers in the city? And what can these unions do to build those bridges starting now?
I think the questions in some ways are related, right? And even with some of the questions about how we build momentum and how we organize. So I don't know if there's a single answer or a silver bullet, but what I would say is when you look at some of the organizing campaigns that are happening in Canada, a lot in the US, in some of the big retail stores like Starbucks and Amazon, some of the teachers unions in Chicago, and there's been a lot of literature on some of these. Why and how have they been successful? Now, I don't think it's a direct parallel to your question because, again, you're dealing with precarity, citizenship questions, so it's hard. But there are some lessons to be learned, right? And what are those lessons? Well, how have the unions been successful in assisting those organizing drives? Well, the Starbucks union is actually a really interesting one. So I'll give it like 10 seconds. What happened was a bunch of organizers reached out to one of the established unions in Buffalo. They said, we want your help, but we don't want you to run this drive. We want to run it. And the unions agreed, to their credit. And they said, we'll give you support, we'll give you training, and we'll give you cash. Those baristas were able to form their own union in alliance with some of the existing industrial unions in Buffalo. And they were really successful, right? So it wasn't, we're going to do it for you. We're going to help you build the capacities to be union organizers. And they've had a lot of success. And that's right out of the McAlevey playbook, right? Where you don't get the obstacles from union leadership that say, well, we're just chasing dues, right? Because if that's the formula, it's not going to work, right? So that's not an answer, but there is some successes of building independent unions where existing unions can be really beneficial.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to end this. I'd like to give everybody a big round of applause.